In the quiet streets of Charleston, South Carolina, the past sometimes seems closer than it should be. The scent of saltwater and old brick mingles in the air as a group of local workers, tasked with restoring an old building, stumbled upon something far more unsettling than they had anticipated. At first, it seemed like an ordinary historical renovation project, the kind that Charleston, with its deep and dark history, was no stranger to. The city, after all, had stood for centuries, weathering storms, battles, and the passing of time, but the workers could never have imagined that beneath the dust and decay, something far more sinister would reveal itself. It all started when a section of the floor in an old colonial building collapsed, revealing a hidden space beneath. What was discovered in the dimly lit room was no ordinary cellar. It was a room that appeared to have been forgotten by time. The walls were remarkably intact, free of the typical rot that one would expect from such an ancient structure. The air was heavy, though not stagnant, as if it had been preserved by some unseen force. But what struck the workers most was the eerie, unnatural stillness that hung in the room. They expected rats. Charleston's centuries-old houses often housed swarms of them, along with other pests and creatures drawn to the warmth of abandoned spaces. But the strange thing was that this room, deep in the heart of the building, had no trace of any animal life. No rats. No snakes. No pests of any kind. At first, the discovery seemed trivial, a historical anomaly, perhaps, or a quirk of the building's architecture. But as the workers continued to sift through the dust, they began to notice more unusual details. The room appeared almost untouched by time. There were no signs of decay or infestation, no signs of the usual rot and destruction that such a neglected space should have endured. It was as though no creature, not even the most tenacious of rats, had dared to enter this place. Curiosity soon gave way to unease. The building, which had stood for over 2 centuries, was suddenly the center of a mystery that no one could quite explain. What was it about this space that kept even the most common pests away? And more importantly, what kind of power or force could control such things? The workers, uneasy in the eerie silence of the room, left the discovery unexamined for the time being. But rumors began to spread, whispers that something darker was tied to the place. Charleston, with its layered history of wealth and brutality, was no stranger to dark secrets. It had once been the center of the transatlantic slave trade, a port city where the lives of thousands of enslaved individuals were bought, sold, and torn apart. The buildings that stood in the old part of town had long been witnesses to horrors that had never been fully acknowledged. And yet, Charleston's rich heritage, its beautiful cobblestone streets, and elegant facades had allowed its dark past to be swept under the rug, a story told in the whispers of the city's elders but rarely confronted in daylight. But now, it seemed as though the city's buried past was rising again, refusing to be forgotten. The building where the discovery had been made was old, a relic of the past that had once housed slaves or perhaps served as a holding pen for the many thousands of people brought to Charleston to be sold and exploited. The very foundation of the city had been built on the backs of the enslaved, their labor and suffering an invisible force that ran through every brick, every corner, and every creaking floorboard of these old homes. It seemed unlikely that the peculiarities of the room were entirely accidental. As more workers came to inspect the site, a sense of unease spread through them. No one could explain why the room had been so untouched, so undisturbed by time and nature. But there was something more to the mystery than the absence of pests. The deeper they delved into the space, the more strange details began to surface. There were signs of ritualistic carvings on the wooden beams of the room, symbols, some of which were familiar to those who had studied Charleston's history. Others, however, were entirely unknown, drawn with deliberate care and precision, but leaving a chill on the spine of anyone who gazed upon them. At the heart of the mystery was the feeling of dread that seemed to hang in the air like a thick fog. It was as though the room itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. And though the workers had no idea what they were uncovering, there was no denying the growing sense of unease that took hold of them. The building's owner, a local historian with a deep interest in Charleston's hidden history, was soon called in to inspect the discovery. It was not long before he too began to feel the weight of something unnatural in the room. The historian, who had spent his life studying the city's past, knew the story of Charleston's involvement in the slave trade all too well. But this discovery was different. The room was not just a relic of that past, it was something else entirely. The absence of life, the symbols, the feeling of oppression in the air, all of it hinted at a darker force that had once been tied to this place, and perhaps still lingered there. At first, the historian tried to rationalize the discovery. Perhaps the symbols were remnants of some old, forgotten practice. Maybe the pests had simply found another part of the building to inhabit. But as the historian stood in the center of the room, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The air was too still, the silence too heavy. The strange sense of dread only deepened as he spent more time in the room, almost as if it were trying to draw him into something he wasn't prepared to confront. It was at this moment, as he stood alone in the dark room, that the realization began to form in his mind: this was no ordinary room. There was a reason it had remained untouched, a reason no living creature had dared to enter. This room, this discovery, was connected to something far older and far darker than the historian had ever anticipated. As the historian stood there, taking in the eerie quiet of the place, he could feel the weight of history pressing in on him. It was as though the past, which had been buried and forgotten for so long, was now coming to the surface, and it was not something he could ignore. Something had happened here, something that had been hidden for generations. And whatever it was far from finished. This room, this discovery, was just the beginning. Charleston, South Carolina, is a city of layers, a place where the past hangs like a shadow over the present. To walk its cobblestone streets is to step into a living, breathing history, a history both grand and tragic. Its pastel-colored homes, the stately mansions that line the historic district, and the pristine gardens belie the deep, often painful roots that run beneath. For all its beauty, Charleston is a city built on an economy of suffering, a place where the wealth of its elite was made through the exploitation of thousands of enslaved Africans. The city's prosperity, its culture, and its very identity were shaped by the dark forces of the transatlantic slave trade, and its legacy still lingers in every corner. By the late 18th century, Charleston was the largest slave port in the United States, with an estimated 40% of all enslaved Africans entering the country passing through its docks. At its peak, more than 100,000 enslaved individuals were brought through Charleston's harbor, many of whom were sold to plantations that stretched across the South. But Charleston was more than just a port city, it was a center of wealth, culture, and power. The city was home to some of the wealthiest families in the country, their fortunes derived from the labor of enslaved people. But behind the elegance of Charleston's upper crust, beneath the pristine facades of its homes and businesses, there was another side to the story, one of violence, dehumanization, and brutality. The city's wealthy elite lived in opulence, their lives defined by luxury and ease, while the enslaved toiled in the fields, worked in the homes of the wealthy, and were treated as little more than property. The chasm between the two worlds, the world of the rich and the world of the enslaved, was as stark as it was inescapable. The enslaved population of Charleston lived in constant fear, subjected to the whims and cruelties of their owners, and were denied even the most basic of human rights. They were not only forced to labor for their survival but also to endure the psychological torment of being treated as less than human. Their lives were defined by their owners' desires, their bodies commodified and stripped of dignity. In the heart of this oppressive system were the places where the enslaved lived and worked, the slave quarters. These small, often cramped spaces were designed to house as many people as possible, with little regard for their well-being. The conditions were often squalid, with poor ventilation, inadequate sanitation, and little to no privacy. These quarters, tucked away behind the grand mansions and sprawling plantations, were the hidden spaces where enslaved individuals spent their lives, isolated from the outside world and from any chance of freedom. The stories of these quarters, the lives of those who had been forced to live in them, remained largely untold for generations, buried beneath the weight of a history that many would rather forget. It is into this world of hidden suffering that the recent discovery in the old building in Charleston must be placed. The building, which had once housed a number of enslaved people, had long been abandoned and forgotten. Yet, when workers uncovered the hidden quarters beneath it, they unknowingly unearthed a piece of Charleston's history that had been deliberately concealed for reasons no one could immediately explain. The discovery was more than just a physical unearthing, it was a reopening of the wounds that had been left by centuries of enslavement and oppression. The building, with its weathered walls and aged beams, had been a silent witness to the horrors of the past. As the workers explored the hidden slave quarters, they unearthed objects, remnants of lives that had been lived in the shadows. Old tools, broken furniture, and scraps of clothing spoke of the daily struggle for survival, of the hard labor that had been demanded without mercy. But it was not just the physical remnants that told the story. It was the very space itself, the way the room seemed to resist the passage of time, as if something had kept it untouched, undisturbed by the forces of decay that had ravaged so many other parts of the building. There was a certain eeriness to the quarters, a sense that the past had not entirely left the place. It was almost as though the spirits of those who had been forced to live there were still lingering, trapped within the walls, unable to escape. And as the workers, and later historians, examined the site, it became increasingly clear that this was no ordinary discovery. The symbols carved into the wood, the strange preservation of the room, and the absence of pests were all signs that something far more sinister was at play. These were not just the remnants of a forgotten past, they were the remnants of a past that had been deliberately hidden, a past that the city, and perhaps the world, was not ready to face. Charleston's history is fraught with contradictions. It is a city that celebrates its wealth and sophistication while ignoring the brutal realities of the system that built it. Its architecture, its culture, its very identity are all wrapped up in a legacy of exploitation and violence. And yet, for many years, the stories of the enslaved people who lived and died in Charleston were ignored, pushed aside in favor of the city's more palatable narrative. The discovery of the slave quarters beneath the building was a reminder that this history could never truly be forgotten, that it would always resurface, no matter how hard people tried to bury it. The room, untouched by time and untouched by the usual decay of such spaces, became a symbol of the city's refusal to reckon with its own history. It was as if the building itself had been sealed off from the world, a place where the past could be contained and hidden away. But now, with the discovery of the quarters, that seal had been broken, and the ghosts of the past were beginning to stir. The story of Charleston's enslaved population is not just a story of the past. It is a story that continues to shape the city's present, influencing the way people live, the way they interact with each other, and the way they remember, or choose to forget, their shared history. And as the mystery of the slave quarters deepened, it became clear that this was a history that could not be silenced, a history that demanded to be acknowledged. This section of the city's story, one of pain, suffering, and resilience, was about to come to light in a way that no one had expected. And as the discovery of the hidden quarters began to unfold, it was impossible to ignore the eerie sense that the past was not finished with Charleston. It had merely been waiting for the right moment to return. As the investigation into the hidden slave quarters in the heart of Charleston progressed, more unsettling details began to surface, each one adding to the growing sense that this was no ordinary historical discovery. Initially, when the workers first unearthed the room, it was easy to dismiss the peculiarities as merely the quirks of an old, forgotten space. After all, Charleston's history was filled with abandoned buildings and long-forgotten relics. But the more the team of historians, archaeologists, and preservationists delved into the room, the more they realized that something far more mysterious was at play. The most striking feature of the quarters was its preservation. Even after being abandoned for centuries, the room seemed almost untouched by the elements. The walls, which should have been worn and crumbling with age, stood firm and unyielding, as though some invisible force had shielded them from the ravages of time. There were no cracks in the stone, no signs of rot in the wood beams, and no signs of water damage that would typically be found in a structure left to decay for such a long period. In fact, the room appeared to have been frozen in time, preserved in a state of near-perfect condition that defied any rational explanation. As the team began to look more closely at the room's features, they noticed other strange details. The floorboards, which should have been warped and damaged from the passage of time, remained pristine. Even the wooden planks that formed the ceiling above had no visible signs of deterioration, as if they had been protected by some unseen force. The air in the room, too, was curiously fresh. Unlike most long-forgotten spaces, which often become musty and thick with the smell of decay, the room had an almost sterile quality to it, as though it had been locked away in a state of preservation for some purpose. The fact that the room remained so undisturbed, despite being buried beneath layers of dust and neglect, was deeply unsettling. But it was not just the physical condition of the room that was strange. As the team began to examine the room's interior, they discovered something even more unsettling: symbols. Scattered throughout the room were strange, intricate carvings etched into the walls and beams. These markings appeared to be deliberate, crafted with great care and precision, and they resembled no known symbols associated with the typical superstitions or folk beliefs of the time. Some were geometric shapes, others looked like abstract figures, while still others resembled symbols that could only be described as mysterious and unidentifiable. The carvings seemed to tell a story, but one that no one could fully understand. Some of the symbols resembled designs used in African spiritual practices, a nod to the ancestral beliefs brought to Charleston by the enslaved individuals who were forced to endure the horrors of the city's plantations. Others were more cryptic, their meaning impossible to decipher without further research. But there was one thing that was undeniable: these symbols were intentional, and they seemed to serve some purpose beyond mere decoration. As one historian put it, the room seemed to have been built as a place of significance, a space that had been imbued with meaning, though that meaning remained elusive. The historians and researchers who examined the space were divided on what these symbols might represent. Some suggested that they could be part of a larger African spiritual tradition, perhaps a form of ritualistic protection designed to ward off evil spirits or ensure the safety of those who lived in the quarters. Others speculated that the symbols might be tied to secret societies or underground movements that had existed among the enslaved population, hidden from the watchful eyes of their oppressors. Yet, as the team dug deeper into their research, no concrete explanations could be found. The symbols were unique, and their exact meaning remained a mystery. What troubled the researchers most, however, was the sense of something watching them. It was not just the eerie quiet that filled the space, but a deeper, more intangible feeling that seemed to permeate the room. There was a certain weight in the air, a heaviness that could not be explained. Those who spent long periods inside the quarters began to report strange sensations, a feeling of being watched, of something moving just beyond their field of vision, or an overwhelming sense of dread that grew stronger the longer they stayed. Several members of the team, normally composed and grounded, reported feeling dizzy, disoriented, or nauseous, as if the room itself were sapping their energy. One of the archaeologists, a seasoned professional who had worked on dozens of digs around the world, was particularly affected by the space. He had spent hours examining the carvings on the walls and documenting the strange symbols when he suddenly felt a cold draft sweep through the room. It was an odd sensation, especially since the room had been sealed off for so long. As he turned to leave, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. The symbols on the walls seemed to be subtly shifting, changing shape in ways that defied logic. At first, he thought it was just the result of the light playing tricks on his eyes, but the feeling that something was altering the room's design persisted. He could not shake the sense that the room was alive, that it was reacting to his presence, as if it were aware of his intrusion. Even as the investigation continued, the room's strange influence began to take hold on more and more of the team. Some members began to feel as though they were being drawn into the mystery, unable to look away from the symbols or the eerie stillness of the place. Others experienced vivid dreams or unsettling visions when they closed their eyes, dreams that were filled with strange symbols and cryptic messages. The more they dug into the history of the building, the more they uncovered unsettling details, but no explanation seemed to fit. It was during one of these late-night research sessions that a breakthrough occurred. A local historian, one with deep knowledge of Charleston's past and its connection to the African diaspora, stumbled upon a reference to a sacred space used by enslaved individuals. The text, though old and obscure, described a hidden sanctuary where those who had been enslaved could seek refuge from their tormentors, a place of spiritual significance that was often concealed from the eyes of their captors. The historian was struck by the similarity between the description and the quarters that had been discovered. The symbols, the preservation, the sense of something otherworldly, it all pointed to the possibility that this was not just a forgotten slave quarters but a space of deep ritual significance, a place designed to protect those who lived there from the horrors of their captivity. As the research into the building and its history continued, it became clear that the quarters were not just a place of shelter, but a site of resistance. The enslaved individuals who had been forced to live there had created a sanctuary for themselves, a space where they could connect with their ancestors and their spiritual beliefs. The strange symbols, the preservation of the room, and the eerie sense of foreboding all pointed to the possibility that the room had been imbued with spiritual protection, a force that had kept it safe from the ravages of time, and from the forces that sought to erase the history of Charleston's enslaved population. But as the team pieced together these details, a more chilling thought began to take root. What if the room's preservation was not just an act of spiritual resistance but something far darker, something that had kept it hidden for a reason? The symbols, the strange sensations, the absence of pests, all of it seemed to suggest that this room was not just a sanctuary, but a prison, a place where something had been trapped, something that was not yet ready to be freed. The discovery of the hidden slave quarters beneath the old building in Charleston quickly moved from an isolated event into something far larger, as whispers began to spread across the city. At first, the accounts were vague, shared in hushed tones among those who had been involved in the investigation. But as more people learned of the discovery, the stories surrounding it began to take on a life of their own. No longer just a historical finding, the quarters and the strange phenomena that surrounded them began to take on an air of mystery and suspicion. The whispers that followed were as much about the unexplainable details of the room as they were about something darker, a sense of dread, of unfinished business, that seemed to cling to the space. The first whispers came from those who had worked on the building, the laborers who had uncovered the hidden space in the first place. They were the first to notice the strange atmosphere that pervaded the room, the sensation that something was wrong, though they couldn't pinpoint exactly what. Most of the workers had been in similar buildings throughout the city, but none of them had encountered a space that felt quite like this one. They spoke of an unsettling feeling, a pervasive sense of being watched, of something heavy and oppressive in the air that made it difficult to breathe, as though the very walls of the room were pressing in on them. It was more than just discomfort, it was as if the room had an energy, a presence, that could not be ignored. At first, these stories were dismissed as superstition, the product of an overactive imagination. But soon, others began to report similar experiences. The local historian who had been called to examine the room, already familiar with Charleston's fraught past, couldn't help but feel a growing sense of unease as he spent more time in the quarters. He noticed how the room seemed to change, subtly, as the days passed. The light, for example, would shift in strange ways, casting odd shadows that seemed to stretch across the room like fingers. The more time he spent in the space, the more unsettled he became, until he too started to experience the strange feeling of being watched. It was a feeling that gnawed at him, as if some unseen force was aware of his presence and was silently observing his every move. The historian couldn't shake the sense that there was something malevolent lurking in the room, something tied to the place's dark past. Then came the reports from the descendants of those who had lived and worked in Charleston's slave quarters. It was these local residents, often the oldest among the city's population, who had the most to say. For years, they had kept the stories to themselves, perhaps out of a desire to keep the painful memories of the past buried or perhaps because they had never been asked to share them. But now, with the discovery of the hidden quarters, the old stories began to surface once more. Many of these stories were deeply personal, passed down through generations like family heirlooms, and they spoke of strange occurrences that had been part of the community's folklore for as long as anyone could remember. According to some of the elders, there had always been rumors about the area where the building stood, tales that spoke of an unnatural fear that seemed to grip the enslaved individuals who had been forced to live in those quarters. They described a feeling of suffocating dread that hung over the space, a sensation that could not be explained away by the normal fears that accompanied the brutal system of slavery. The people who lived there, they claimed, would often speak of strange noises in the night, of footsteps echoing in empty hallways, and of whispers carried on the wind. The elders recounted tales of those who had tried to sleep in the quarters but had been overcome with terror, unable to stay the night, and leaving in the early hours with no explanation other than the overwhelming sense that something evil was present. What was most chilling about these accounts was that they weren't isolated experiences. There was a common thread among them, a shared detail that seemed to run through each story. Every single person who had spent time in the building, whether it was a former slave, a worker, or even a visitor, had experienced something that could not be explained. Every one of them, regardless of their background or upbringing, had spoken of the same ominous sensation, an invisible presence that seemed to haunt the very air, a feeling of being surrounded by something unseen but profoundly felt. The whispers spread beyond the walls of the building and into the streets of Charleston. Soon, locals began to speculate about the discovery, and the rumors took on a life of their own. Some suggested that the slave quarters had been built on land cursed by the indigenous people who had once inhabited the area, a place where dark rituals had been performed long before the first European settlers arrived. Others believed that the strange phenomena in the building were connected to the many untold stories of pain and suffering that had occurred there. Perhaps the spirits of the enslaved individuals who had been forced to live in those quarters were still trapped, unable to move on from the atrocities they had endured. Some of the more superstitious residents of Charleston believed the building was cursed, an idea that had gained traction over time. The whispers of a curse spread quickly, fueled by the mysterious circumstances surrounding the discovery and the eerie reports from those who had entered the quarters. Many claimed that the absence of rats and snakes, creatures that should have been found in such a space, was evidence of something supernatural at play. Animals, they argued, could sense the presence of evil, and their refusal to enter the room was a sign that something malevolent was at work. For some, the discovery seemed like a moment of reckoning, a sign that Charleston's dark history could no longer be ignored or forgotten. The whispers surrounding the hidden slave quarters reflected the city's ongoing struggle with its past, a past that many had tried to bury or forget, but one that still lingered, affecting the present in ways no one could have predicted. The more the whispers spread, the more they seemed to take on a life of their own, growing louder and more insistent as the days passed. Despite the growing tension, there was still a significant portion of the population that refused to acknowledge the connection between the building's strange history and the city's troubled past. Some dismissed the whispers as the work of those who were too eager to sensationalize an old building, too quick to find meaning in coincidences. Others argued that the strange feelings and experiences reported by those who had entered the quarters were nothing more than the product of collective hysteria or suggestion. They insisted that there was nothing supernatural about the building, that it was simply an old structure, one that had seen centuries of history and wear, and that the odd experiences were just the result of overactive imaginations. But no matter how much the rational voices tried to quash the rumors, the whispers persisted. They continued to grow, fueled by the unsettling details that emerged from the investigation and by the stories passed down through generations. Charleston's history, with all its ghosts and secrets, refused to stay buried. The whispers of the past had returned, and they were impossible to ignore. As the discovery of the hidden slave quarters continued to make waves throughout Charleston, the growing sense of unease and mystery surrounding the building began to draw the attention of local authorities. The initial shock and intrigue of the revelation soon gave way to a more organized response, one that sought to suppress the investigation and quell the rising tensions. What had begun as a curious historical find was swiftly being overshadowed by an undercurrent of discomfort, fear, and distrust. The more the whispers grew, the more the voices of reason and authority sought to quiet them. It became evident that not everyone in Charleston was willing to confront the darkness buried beneath the city's grand history. Local leaders, many of whom held positions of power in the city's Historical Preservation Society or local government, began to express concerns over the investigation's direction. The building, after all, was not just an old structure, it was a part of the city's heritage. To acknowledge that something inexplicable had occurred within its walls would be to open up a floodgate of uncomfortable questions. What was the real purpose of the slave quarters that had been unearthed? What dark secrets did they hold? And, more importantly, how much of the city's past would need to be reckoned with if the truth was allowed to surface. For many in positions of power, the idea of digging into this part of Charleston's past was seen as a threat. They feared that the more the public learned about the discovery, the more it would stir up old, painful memories and potentially cause social and political unrest. Charleston, a city that had built much of its wealth and identity on the back of slavery, was still a place where divisions between the past and present were deeply felt. Acknowledging the horrors that had occurred there, especially in such a public way, would risk unraveling the fragile fabric of social cohesion. The possibility that this building was more than just a relic of the past, that it might be connected to something supernatural or deeply spiritual, only made the situation more fraught. The historians and archaeologists involved in the investigation quickly began to face pressure. The local academic community, once eager to uncover and preserve Charleston's history, found itself divided. Some scholars were more than willing to delve into the strange occurrences at the building, driven by a desire to uncover the truth, no matter how unsettling it might be. But others, particularly those with ties to the city's influential families and institutions, began to push back. There were quiet conversations behind closed doors, subtle but clear attempts to steer the investigation away from the more disturbing aspects of the find. In a city as steeped in tradition as Charleston, acknowledging that the horrors of slavery might have left a lasting, possibly supernatural scar on the landscape was simply too much to bear. Some members of the local preservation society, influential in shaping the narrative of Charleston's past, even went so far as to attempt to discredit the findings. They pushed for a more sanitized version of the story, one that would focus on the historical significance of the building while downplaying or ignoring the more troubling aspects. There were calls to halt the excavation of the slave quarters, to focus instead on restoring the property to its original state as a symbol of Charleston's proud heritage. The thought of confronting the building's darker history, of grappling with the possibility that it held some kind of cursed or malevolent force, was deemed unthinkable. This pushback from Charleston's elite came at a time when the city was already struggling with its public image. On one hand, Charleston had become known for its beautiful historic district, its grand mansions, and its tourism industry. The city's antebellum past was, in many ways, its defining feature. On the other hand, the legacy of slavery still cast a long shadow over the city. The social and racial tensions that had simmered for centuries were far from resolved. The painful truth of what Charleston had been built upon, and who had been forced to pay the price for its prosperity, had never been fully addressed. The discovery of the slave quarters seemed to bring all of this into sharp focus, reminding the city that its history was not as clear-cut as it might have liked to believe. As a result, those involved in the investigation were pressured to abandon their research. Scholars, in particular, found themselves caught between their professional duty to uncover the truth and the political reality of the situation. Some began to quietly withdraw from the project, no longer willing to risk their careers or reputations by being associated with a controversial, potentially explosive discovery. Others, sensing the danger of continuing down this path, began to issue carefully worded statements that distanced themselves from the more sensational claims about the building, focusing instead on its historical value as a preservation project. At the same time, the local media, which had initially covered the discovery with eager fascination, began to shift its tone. The sensational stories that had captivated the public's imagination gave way to more cautious reports, often framed in a way that downplayed the more eerie aspects of the find. There were fewer mentions of the strange symbols in the room, the absence of pests, or the sense of dread that had plagued those who entered. Instead, the media's coverage began to focus more on the building's historical significance and the need to preserve it as a symbol of Charleston's past, a past that, as some argued, should be remembered, but not lingered upon. Despite the mounting pressure to suppress the investigation, a small group of individuals remained determined to uncover the truth. Among them were a few brave historians, local activists, and descendants of enslaved individuals who had long felt that their ancestors' stories had been forgotten or ignored. They believed that Charleston's true history needed to be confronted, not concealed. These individuals found themselves on the front lines of a battle between the city's desire to preserve its image and their own need for accountability and truth. They saw the building's discovery as more than just a historical artifact. It was a symbol of everything Charleston had tried to forget, a piece of the past that could no longer be hidden away. But despite their efforts, the investigation into the building began to lose momentum. Funding for the project was withdrawn, and support from key institutions quickly evaporated. The research team, once full of enthusiasm, found themselves working with fewer resources and less backing from the city. The more they pushed, the more they were met with resistance. In the end, the building was abandoned once more, left to fade into the background of Charleston's crowded history. The investigation, once brimming with potential, was quietly swept under the rug, as if the city itself had decided it was better left untouched. The whispers of the past, though persistent, seemed to fall on deaf ears. Charleston, it seemed, was not ready to face what lay buried beneath its streets, and the investigation into the slave quarters was quietly, almost mysteriously, shut down. The room, with its symbols, its strange preservation, and its oppressive energy, was left to remain an enigma, a ghost story that would never be fully told, a mystery that would never be solved. The suppression of the investigation did not quell the whispers, but it did silence them in the public eye. And as Charleston moved forward, its painful past remained in the shadows, where it could be ignored, or forgotten, once again. But in the silence, one could not help but wonder, what else might still be hidden, waiting to be discovered? Despite the city's efforts to suppress the investigation and quiet the growing whispers, something in Charleston refused to stay buried. The tensions that had been simmering beneath the surface of the city's historical narrative began to boil over as more individuals, unaffected by the political pressure to abandon the mystery, pursued the truth with growing urgency. What was meant to be an academic investigation soon transformed into something far darker and more pressing, as strange events and increasingly unsettling experiences plagued those who dared to continue probing the building's secrets. It started with small, seemingly insignificant incidents, things that could easily be dismissed as coincidence. Researchers who had once entered the building without fear now found themselves hesitant, unsure of what lay waiting for them behind the walls. Some began to experience feelings of disorientation, a sense of vertigo or dizziness that struck without warning, even in the most well-lit parts of the building. Those who spent hours within the room, whether studying the carvings or simply observing, began to report inexplicable shifts in their perception. The shadows on the walls seemed to lengthen unnaturally, and the air would grow colder despite the temperature outside. It was as if the room itself were rejecting their presence, pushing them away, or perhaps trying to warn them. As the days went on, the phenomena grew more intense. One night, a researcher working late alone in the building began to hear faint sounds echoing from within the room, soft whispers, indistinct voices that seemed to come from the walls themselves. It was almost as though the building was speaking, telling its own story, but only in fragments that refused to be understood. The researcher, already on edge from the mounting tension and the eerie atmosphere of the space, tried to ignore the whispers, attributing them to the wind or the creaks and groans of an old building. But the whispers grew louder, more insistent, until they were unmistakable. By the time the researcher fled the building in a panic, he was certain that he had heard words, real words, that were not his own. The following day, that same researcher returned to the building to confront the unsettling experience. He stood in the room, the site of the original discovery, and tried to collect his thoughts, willing the strange sensation to disappear. But as he stared at the walls, something caught his eye. The symbols, those cryptic, intricate carvings, appeared different, almost as though they had shifted in some way. The markings, which had once seemed static, now seemed to shimmer with an ethereal quality, their shapes distorting under the light. The researcher, frozen in place, reached out to touch one of the carvings, but as his fingers brushed against the wood, a cold jolt shot through his body, as if a surge of electricity had passed through the room. Shaken and unsure of what to make of it, the researcher stepped back, his mind racing. The atmosphere in the room had changed, had become more oppressive, as though the walls were closing in on him. The coldness in the air intensified, and the sense of being watched returned, stronger than ever. It was no longer just a feeling, it was a palpable presence, an undeniable force. As the researcher made his way toward the exit, the room seemed to resist his departure, as though something was trying to hold him there. The door that had once opened with ease now felt heavy, as if it were reluctant to let him leave. These experiences were not isolated. The more the research team investigated, the more they were confronted by strange and inexplicable occurrences. Another member of the team, a seasoned archaeologist who had spent years uncovering ancient ruins across the globe, reported a growing sense of paranoia whenever he worked near the building. He described how the air felt thick with tension, like a storm was always on the verge of breaking. One evening, after spending hours inside the room, he left with the sensation that something had followed him out, an unshakable presence that lingered even as he made his way down the street. At first, he dismissed it as exhaustion or the side effect of spending too much time immersed in a project that had taken an increasingly unsettling turn. But as the days went on, the feeling didn't fade. It grew stronger. People began to talk. Some researchers had to be escorted out of the building after becoming visibly distressed, pale and jittery as though they had witnessed something far beyond their understanding. Those who had never set foot in the building, yet heard the growing rumors, spoke in hushed tones of the room's curse, the idea that something in the building was alive, something that fed on the fear and unease of those who dared to enter. The initial idea that the room might have been a space of spiritual protection for the enslaved took on a more ominous edge. If the room had been a place where people sought refuge, what if it had become something else over the years? What if the presence within the walls was no longer benevolent, but instead something far darker, something that sought to trap those who sought to uncover its secrets? Even the residents of Charleston, who had largely dismissed the supernatural claims surrounding the building, began to feel the tension mounting. Strange occurrences were reported throughout the city, unexplained cold spots in the middle of summer, objects in homes being displaced without explanation, and unsettling dreams of the past that seemed to haunt the sleeping. There were whispers that the building had somehow infected the entire neighborhood, that the dark energy that surrounded the quarters had begun to spill over into the surrounding streets. Some claimed that the whispers from the building could now be heard in the alleyways, that the symbols carved into its walls had spread in dreams to the minds of those who lived nearby. The escalation of the phenomena drew attention from a larger public audience. The news outlets that had once downplayed the story now began to cover it in greater detail, framing it as a tale of the supernatural, a modern mystery that harkened back to the city's darkest days. Local and national news outlets were now covering the strange events with increasing frequency, fueling the public's fascination with the building's mysteries. The authorities, long eager to suppress the investigation, began to feel the pressure. They were no longer just dealing with a group of researchers and a few historians, they were facing an entire city that was on edge, a city gripped by fear and curiosity in equal measure. It became clear that the building was no longer a mere historical artifact, it was a symbol of something far more profound, something tied to the very identity of Charleston. The city's past, the history of slavery, of oppression, and of untold suffering, was being unearthed in a way that could no longer be ignored. The mystery of the building, the haunting presence that seemed to grow stronger with each passing day, was a reminder that history cannot be erased, no matter how hard one tries. And the tension that had been building in the city was a reflection of the unresolved trauma that had shaped it for centuries. The more the team investigated, the more they realized that they were no longer in control. The building had taken on a life of its own, its mysteries deepening with every step they took. Each new discovery only seemed to raise more questions, and the sense of escalating danger was impossible to ignore. It was as if the room, and the building that contained it, were pulling them in, drawing them closer to some unknown truth that no one was prepared to face. And yet, despite the fear, despite the warnings from those who had already experienced its effects, the researchers pressed on. The mystery was too compelling to abandon, and the truth, no matter how terrifying, had to be uncovered. But as the tension mounted and the strange occurrences intensified, the team began to realize that there were limits to how far they could push the investigation. Some began to question whether the building was truly a place of refuge, or whether it had become something far darker, something that had been waiting for them all along. The deeper they dug, the more they understood that some secrets were meant to remain hidden, and some places, once disturbed, might never let go. As the disturbances within the abandoned building deepened and the sense of malevolent energy surrounding the hidden slave quarters escalated, the researchers, along with a growing number of concerned locals and historians, found themselves at a crossroads. What had started as a straightforward historical investigation into the building's origins and its ties to Charleston's enslaved population was now entangled in a larger, more troubling mystery that threatened to spiral beyond their control. Despite the mounting fear, the scientific community, the city's elite, and even a few brave paranormal investigators insisted that the phenomena within the building could be explained through more conventional means. In fact, they became determined to provide an explanation that would restore the balance of reason and quash the growing rumors of curses, spirits, and malevolent forces. In response to the increasingly alarming accounts of strange occurrences, disorienting shifts in temperature, strange shadows, unexplainable noises, one group of local scientists and historians sought to examine the building's physical properties. They believed that the phenomena were the result of natural, albeit rare, environmental conditions. Geophysical factors, they theorized, could explain the disorienting temperature fluctuations and the odd behavior of the building's internal atmosphere. Charleston, with its humid subtropical climate and proximity to the ocean, could be prone to atmospheric anomalies. The humidity could cause wood and other materials to shift and warp in ways that created visual distortions, while mold or mildew could produce strange, faint smells and a sense of dizziness that was easily mistaken for something more sinister. It was this approach that prompted the first wave of more rational explanations, with experts offering grounded, scientific insights. One prominent geologist from a nearby university proposed that the shifting temperature in the building could be due to the presence of underground water channels. These channels, common in Charleston's low-lying terrain, could be affecting the structure's internal climate. The faint whispers and disorienting sounds, he suggested, were nothing more than the echoes of shifting pipes or natural sounds of air moving through the building's aging structure. While these explanations offered some comfort to the more scientifically inclined, they did little to quell the growing sense of unease among the research team and the public. The paranormal claims persisted, and those who had experienced the strange events in the building were not so easily swayed by rational theories. Simultaneously, a team of psychologists and experts in human behavior took a more psychological approach. They suggested that the collective stress and fear surrounding the discovery of the quarters might be triggering a mass hysteria effect. According to their analysis, the weight of Charleston's historical trauma, the legacy of slavery, the brutality of the past, and the unaddressed collective guilt, could manifest in ways that caused people to perceive normal, everyday occurrences as something far more terrifying. The team speculated that the power of suggestion and the looming presence of a painful, unresolved history might be enough to warp the perception of those working in or near the building. Once the first researcher had reported hearing whispers, others, primed by the growing rumors and a heightened sense of fear, might have subconsciously filled in the gaps with their own interpretations, magnifying the phenomenon through a kind of collective delusion. Although the psychological explanations had some merit, they failed to account for the growing list of unusual experiences, instances where the researchers felt a cold presence or saw objects in the room shift slightly when they weren't looking. Skeptics of the paranormal theories argued that the power of the mind to influence perception was indeed potent, especially when people were under stress. But the eerie, consistent reports from the team and the troubling nature of the experiences, something that continued to occur despite the best efforts to rationalize it, left an uneasy void in the scientific explanations. It was clear that not everything could be dismissed as mere coincidence or mass hysteria. Meanwhile, as the scientific community continued to pore over natural explanations for the strange happenings in the building, others turned their attention to the more spiritual or supernatural interpretations of events. Paranormal investigators were quick to see the potential for their theories to hold weight. They posited that the building, given its horrific history, might have become a focal point for lingering spiritual energy. It was well known that places where trauma had been inflicted, whether through violence, oppression, or suffering, often became hotbeds for paranormal activity. The slave quarters, with their deep connection to the pain and torment of Charleston's enslaved population, could be the source of a powerful, lingering presence. Paranormal experts suggested that the enslaved individuals who had been forced to live in these quarters, often in appalling conditions, subjected to brutal treatment, might have left behind residual energy. According to these investigators, trauma, particularly unresolved trauma, could imprint itself on a space, creating what was often called a haunting. The spirits of the enslaved might still be trapped in the building, unable to find peace due to the harsh conditions they had endured. Some paranormal investigators even suggested that the building itself, as a repository of such pain and suffering, had become an anchor for the spirits of those who had died without ever experiencing freedom. One of the most compelling theories presented by the paranormal investigators revolved around the idea that the room had been imbued with spiritual protection by those who had lived there. Perhaps the carvings on the walls, which had initially been dismissed as mere folk art, were not only artistic expressions but also symbols meant to shield the enslaved individuals from the malevolent forces around them. These investigators believed that, over time, the room's spiritual significance had evolved. What had been a place of refuge had transformed into something more dangerous, an area where dark energy had accumulated over the years, feeding on the pain and anger that had festered in the room since the days of slavery. The most unsettling aspect of the supernatural theory, however, was the notion that the building might be cursed. Several individuals claimed that the room had been sealed off for a reason, that the strange phenomena were not a random occurrence, but the result of an ancient curse placed upon the building. These paranormal experts drew upon Charleston's own folklore and stories of curses placed on places of great historical trauma. In their view, the building was not just haunted, it was a place where the very ground had been stained by the atrocities of the past, where the spiritual energy of those who had suffered there had become concentrated in a way that could not be easily undone. Despite these theories, there was no definitive proof to support any one explanation. Each theory, whether scientific or supernatural, seemed to fail at addressing all the evidence. The scientific community could not fully explain the persistence of the phenomena in the building, especially when faced with the unsettling consistency of the events. The psychological explanations, while valid in their own right, could not account for the eerie sensations, the odd preservation of the space, or the lingering feeling of being watched by something unseen. The paranormal theories, though fascinating, remained speculative, lacking the concrete evidence required to convince even the most open-minded of investigators. As the days wore on, it became apparent that the more the building was investigated, the more questions it raised. The attempts to explain the events through scientific, psychological, and spiritual lenses each had their limitations, and with no single explanation able to offer a complete understanding of what was happening, the mystery deepened. Those who had been drawn into the investigation, historians, paranormal experts, and researchers alike, found themselves at a crossroads. They had started this journey with a desire to understand the past, to uncover the untold stories of those who had lived in Charleston's slave quarters, but they were now faced with a much larger, much darker mystery, a mystery that no one seemed equipped to solve. In the face of these unexplainable events, the once hopeful investigation had become a battleground of ideas, a place where reason, faith, and the supernatural collided in ways that left everyone questioning what they truly knew. The building had revealed its power, and with it, the realization that some truths might be beyond the reach of simple explanation. Whatever force or presence lingered within its walls, it had become clear, it was not going to let its secrets go easily. As the tension surrounding the discovery of the slave quarters in Charleston mounted, so too did the sense of impending doom. What had once seemed like an exciting historical breakthrough, a chance to uncover the forgotten and painful truths of the past, had now become a haunting endeavor, one fraught with dread and unanswered questions. The efforts to explain away the strange occurrences within the building, whether through scientific, psychological, or supernatural lenses, had not alleviated the growing sense of danger that clung to the investigation. What had started as an academic pursuit had descended into something darker, something far beyond the comprehension of those involved. As the phenomena intensified, more researchers leaving the building in a state of fear, reports of strange noises and unexplainable shifts in the atmosphere becoming more frequent, the investigation began to unravel. Those who had initially thrown themselves into the search for answers began to distance themselves, both physically and emotionally, from the building. The pressure of dealing with the unknown, combined with the mounting fear and the personal toll it was taking, led to a fracturing of the team. What had begun as a collaborative effort to uncover a piece of history turned into a fractured group of individuals, each haunted by their own experiences and doubts. The first signs of collapse came in the form of retreat. Several of the researchers, feeling the weight of the building's oppressive atmosphere, began to abandon the investigation altogether. They quietly left Charleston, without fanfare or explanation, disappearing from the project as if they had never been involved. They were replaced by a few remaining scholars, but even they began to feel the pressure of isolation. The local community, once supportive of the project, now seemed increasingly distant. The more strange and inexplicable the phenomena became, the more skeptical and withdrawn the people of Charleston grew. What had been a matter of public curiosity had slowly morphed into a problem best left ignored. Many of the residents began to steer clear of the area, too fearful to even walk past the building. Those who had been involved with the project now found themselves isolated, their work increasingly dismissed and ridiculed by a community unwilling to confront the uncomfortable truths the building had brought to light. The isolation of the investigation only seemed to fuel the mystery. Without the support of the larger community, the researchers and historians became more and more obsessed with the building. Their work grew increasingly frantic as they sought to uncover the truth, but they had no way of knowing how deep the mystery ran, or how much danger they were in. The building itself, once a site of academic interest, now felt like an entity unto itself, resisting, rejecting, and confounding every attempt to understand it. As time went on, the remaining researchers began to report increasingly bizarre occurrences. One historian, who had been working tirelessly to decode the symbols carved into the room's walls, began to see the symbols shift in front of his eyes. He would swear that they rearranged themselves, forming new patterns, new shapes, always just beyond his comprehension. Another scholar, a seasoned archaeologist who had spent years in the field, began to experience vivid dreams while working in the building. These dreams, filled with strange visions of enslaved individuals, cryptic symbols, and distant screams, bled into his waking life. He found himself haunted by the images, unable to shake the sense that the building was calling to him, pulling him deeper into its mystery. It was the psychological toll of these experiences that began to take the most profound effect on the team. The building, it seemed, had an insidious power to break down the minds of those who dared to confront it. Researchers who had once been resolute in their commitment to uncover the truth began to fracture. Some turned to alcohol, others to isolation, unable to face what they had seen. One historian, once vibrant and full of energy, became withdrawn, refusing to speak about the events that had unfolded. He was often seen staring into the distance, his eyes hollow with a mixture of fear and disbelief. The once thriving investigation had become a slow, steady collapse of the human spirit. It wasn't just the researchers who suffered. As the investigation began to falter, those who had worked on the site, the construction workers, the archaeologists, the support staff, began to feel the effects of the building's malevolent presence. Several of the workers reported that they felt an overwhelming sense of dread whenever they entered the building, even if they were only passing through the hallways. Some of them refused to return at all, while others quit their jobs outright. A few spoke of strange dreams, ones that mirrored the nightmares of the researchers, a sense of being trapped in the building, unable to escape the watchful eyes of unseen forces. A local historian, who had been documenting the events surrounding the building, became ill after spending several days at the site. Doctors could find no physical cause for his sudden decline, but his symptoms, dizziness, nausea, and severe headaches, only seemed to worsen with each return to the building. The sense of isolation only deepened as the days went on. Those who remained on the investigation began to wonder if they were the only ones who could see the truth. They questioned whether their experiences were somehow connected, or if they had simply lost their grip on reality. Each day spent in the building felt like another step toward madness, and yet they could not stop themselves from returning. The feeling that they were being watched, followed by an unseen presence, was so overpowering that they could not shake it. Even when they were not in the building, it lingered, following them into their homes, into their dreams. It was during this period of isolation that the building itself seemed to grow more insistent. The room where the slave quarters had been discovered, the very heart of the mystery, began to show signs of having a will of its own. Objects would move when no one was looking. The temperature would drop inexplicably, only to rise again. There were reports of strange flashes of light, shadows darting across the room in the periphery of vision, and an overwhelming sense that the building was pushing back against the investigation. Whatever had been left behind in that room seemed to be actively resisting the attempt to uncover its secrets. But it wasn't just the physical and supernatural manifestations that were unsettling. It was the feeling of something being hidden, something deliberately kept away from the investigators. It was as if the building itself was deliberately isolating them, cutting them off from the outside world, forcing them to confront the darkness within its walls alone. The isolation became a kind of psychological warfare, breaking down the minds of those involved and leaving them unable to trust their own perceptions. The building had become more than just a physical structure, it had become a place of confinement, a prison of the mind as much as it was a prison of the body. The collapse was complete when, one by one, the last of the investigators walked away. The public silence that followed was deafening. The press, once so eager to cover the story, now spoke little of it. Charleston's local government, which had been quick to capitalize on the building's historical significance, now moved to distance itself from the controversy. The building was sealed off once again, and the investigation was quietly abandoned, left to fade into the city's complicated history. And yet, even as the investigation faltered and the story was silenced, the building remained. Its secrets, whatever they were, had not been unearthed, and the presence within its walls had not been banished. For those who had been involved, the memories lingered, visions of strange symbols, eerie whispers, and the suffocating sense of something ancient and unseen. What had been meant as an uncovering of the past had turned into an unraveling of the present, and the consequences of their intrusion remained, unspoken, in the shadows of Charleston's history. The aftermath of the investigation into the hidden slave quarters in Charleston left a city divided. What had once been an academic and historical pursuit, aimed at uncovering forgotten truths, had become a chilling mystery that refused to be explained or fully understood. As the researchers and the few remaining witnesses withdrew from the building, unable or unwilling to confront the mounting terror that it seemed to harbor, the city itself began to quietly bury the story. The once energetic buzz surrounding the discovery of the slave quarters faded into hushed whispers, then silence, as if the city had collectively chosen to look away from the darkness that had been uncovered beneath its streets. But despite the silence that followed, the question remained: what had truly transpired in that building, and why had its revelation been met with such overwhelming fear? At first, the public response to the investigation's collapse was one of confusion. Those who had been initially captivated by the possibility of learning more about Charleston's history, its dark past of slavery and human suffering, now found themselves with little more than fragmented accounts and unanswered questions. The researchers who had ventured into the depths of the building, confronting its mysteries head-on, were suddenly nowhere to be found. Some had left Charleston entirely, disappearing without a trace, while others remained in the city, too disillusioned to speak of what they had witnessed. The historical community, which had once rallied behind the idea of shedding light on a forgotten chapter of the city's past, now seemed strangely quiet. Few scholars were willing to risk their reputations by addressing the building's haunting reputation, and even fewer dared to publicly acknowledge the potential supernatural forces at play. The city, too, seemed eager to move on. Charleston, ever proud of its historic roots, had long been a city defined by its elegance and charm, its antebellum homes, its grand mansions, and its association with a more romanticized version of the past. The uncovering of the hidden slave quarters had been intended to shed light on the city's complicated history, but the more the investigation progressed, the more uncomfortable it became. The idea that the city's prosperity had been built upon the backs of enslaved individuals, coupled with the strange events that seemed to linger around the building, forced Charleston to confront a reality that it had long preferred to ignore. The building, once a symbol of forgotten history, now stood as a haunting reminder of a legacy that the city wasn't ready to fully acknowledge. As the investigation faltered and the once enthusiastic team of researchers disbanded, the press coverage surrounding the discovery dwindled. The media outlets, which had initially covered the story with a mixture of fascination and sensationalism, quickly shifted their focus to other stories. The building, and the mystery that had surrounded it, were quietly swept under the rug, with only a few scattered reports lingering in the archives of local newspapers. The mystery that had once captured the imagination of the public was slowly and deliberately erased from the collective consciousness of Charleston. The narrative was rewritten, and the story that had once seemed like an important historical revelation faded into the background. But as the city turned its attention to more pressing matters, there were those who could not forget what had happened. Some of the local residents, particularly the descendants of enslaved individuals who had long been marginalized by the city's historical narrative, continued to speak in hushed tones about the building and the dark secrets it seemed to hold. For them, the silence surrounding the investigation was not an indication that the story was over, rather, it felt like a deliberate erasure, an attempt to bury the painful truths of Charleston's past. The building had become a symbol of all that had been ignored, all that had been swept under the rug for so long. To them, the refusal to confront the haunting presence within the building was an extension of the same denial that had plagued Charleston for generations. The city had never fully reckoned with its past, and this investigation, this glimpse into the hidden horrors of history, was simply one more attempt to silence the voices that had long been unheard. For the few who remained committed to uncovering the truth, the silence of the city was suffocating. The building, though abandoned and sealed off, continued to haunt their thoughts. Even as the physical investigation was shut down, the emotional toll of what they had experienced lingered. The few remaining historians and researchers who had dared to spend time in the building found themselves marked by the experience. Some suffered from vivid nightmares, while others became obsessed with deciphering the strange symbols and the mysterious presence they had encountered. Despite their best efforts to distance themselves from the investigation, they found that the building, and its unexplained mysteries, had taken root in their minds. The sense of dread that had surrounded them in the building seemed to follow them, like an unshakable shadow. It was as if the building had left something behind, something intangible yet profoundly disturbing.